Good evening. Canadians embarked for Europe to participate in the Great War. Our troops left farms, cities, families, and loved ones to enter the most ghastly conflict of modern times. Canadian doctors accompanied our troops to the Western Front and beyond. I witnessed many horrors, such as diseases, poison gas, shell fire, venereal disease, alcohol abuse, self-inflicted wounds, and executions. I was one of the doctors who witnessed these events and recorded my experiences in a journal. However, before we begin, I must first explain the nature of the medical services in the Army. A division consists of about 20,000 men, and 3 brigades form each division. There are 3 field ambulances in each brigade. Each FA, or field ambulance, has a commanding officer and 8 medical officers. The Assistant Director of Medical Services, or ADMS, is in charge of medical services for the entire division. A regimental aid post is a place where stretcher bearers would bring the wounded, and they are left until the field ambulances take them away. They were typically a flimsy affair about 6 feet high with sandbag walls and some small timbers across the top supporting a sheet of corrugated iron and a single layer of sandbags. I slept in a dugout built for 4, but it was leaking so badly that only one side could be used. One person slept above me. There must have been a good 3 inches of liquid mud on the floor, and more was coming in all the time. The damp, musty, rotten odor was terrible. A casualty clearing station, or CCS, was a place to treat a man sufficiently for his return to duty, or in most cases, to enable him to be evacuated to a base hospital. It was not a place for long-term stay. They were located about 7 miles from the front, out of artillery range. They'd operate as a field hospital and were capable of performing major surgery. A DRS, or Divisional Rest Station, was a place to treat minor wounds, and the man would be expected to return back to the trenches within 7 days. I was born on the family farm near Rosemount, Ontario. My medical degree was completed at the University of Toronto in 1913. I then became staff at the Toronto Hospital for the Insane at 999 Queen Street West. Dr. Williams, who was also on staff of the Toronto Hospital for the Insane, declared one day that he was going to enlist in the No. 2 CCS. He was a graduate of Queen's University. He asked me to show him where the recruiting office was located in the medical building. On the way back to the hospital, I decided to enlist in the same unit. So at the age of 25, I joined the Officers Training Corps in November 1914. I received a commission of lieutenant in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Part of my training was in equitation, or horsemanship. I was so eager to go overseas before the war ended, I resigned my commission on the 2nd of March, 1915, and enlisted as a private in the No. 1 CCS. I went to England in April 1915, and on the 26th of May, I received a temporary commission of lieutenant under annual contract with the Royal Army Medical Corps. During my training in England, the military police were very strict. And a number of our chaps were in the guardhouse were being drunk because there was a wet canteen in the camp with real English beer. It was much better than Canadian beer and had a real kick to it. In London, I was stopped frequently by people who spotted that I was Canadian. They would ask if I know so-and-so in Calgary, Winnipeg, or Verdun. They seemed to have no comprehension of the vastness of Canada. The sergeant had a difficult task. He would make rounds at night to ensure that everyone was in bed. He would come to the door and call out the names of the men sleeping there. Well, one night, Corporal Martin and I answered for 10 others who were out on the town. The training consisted of stretcher and infantry drills, ambulance drills, splints, lectures to the men on sanitation, medical equipment, stretcher bearer duties, nursing duties, orderly duties, tent pitching, and physical drill, just to name a few. Finally, I have moved close to the front in July 1915 in France. I'm working in a temporary hospital, and it is nice to get down to medical work again. I'm billeted in a house, and I'm quite comfortable considering the conditions of war. I do feel sorry for the civilians who are caught up in the war. There is plenty of wine here, and it is very cheap. A large bottle cost only 24 cents. I seldom drink any water. By Jove, old boy. The wine here does not make up for the fact that a fellow does miss the good company of our Canadian girls. The girls here are heavy and fat and homely. The ADMS was so anxious to keep men out of the hospital that he ordered the slightly wounded to be sent to Beauchet, DRS. Treating the patient one day, I felt a piece of metal at the tip of a probe. It was at about a depth of 1 inch at the point of the shoulder. I decided to remove it. It was a bullet, and probably a spent bullet, because it had not penetrated too far. It was clearly painful for the patient, and I decided that would be the last such operation I would perform without an anesthetic. The CO disliked the use of anesthetics at the DRS. I recall my first case. It was France, October 1915, at the front. My first case was a chap who had been picked up just 20 yards away. He had a piece of shrapnel through his left lung and died within a few minutes after being brought in. Another chap, full of shrapnel, died on his way into the hospital. The wounds of the 5 men killed at the nearby battery were gruesome. 3 had the tops of their heads blown off, and their brains were splashed all over their uniforms. 1 had his head blown off at the shoulders. His abdomen was ripped open. His intestines lay between his boots. All 5 had either arms or legs fractured or blown off. Steady, old boy. My Section C cook became very nervous, so I replaced him with the Section B cook. After the German shelling had died down that evening, I went out and I found and I threw a large stone on the corrugated iron roof of the cookhouse just as one of our heavy guns had fired. The cook dashed out of the cookhouse and ran over to the mess claiming the cookhouse had been hit. Well, we all inspected the cookhouse and declared the building to be intact. Only Lieutenant Rowe was aware of my stone shell. It was just in front of our rampart that I had my first close encounter with a heavy shell. I was walking across the courtyard in the afternoon and heard a terrible gushing sound as the shell landed. The air displacement, noise, and concussion will never be forgotten. Pieces of shell screamed past me, pieces of brick and timber were flying everywhere. I was covered with mud. For a moment, I had no idea what was happening. Later, I learned that that shell struck just 30 feet from me. The men were very lousy in October 1915 and did their best to rid themselves of these pests. One man was paraded at the medical tent by the sergeant major. He was in appalling condition and plastered with lice. By Jove, the underside of his shirt was glazed white with lice eggs. It was clearly evident he was mentally defective and not fit to serve with a rifle. He was the most dirty and lousy individual I had encountered in the entire regiment. Once, I was almost desperate with countless lice. Finally, I got a large tub and soaked my blankets, shirts, socks, and underwear in a solution of 1 in 20 carbolic acid for 24 hours. The lice turned white when dead. I was informed by Major Rogers that one of his men was swinging the lead with a rheumatic shoulder. When the man appeared on sick parade, I recognized him as a regular on every sick parade. I warned him that he was swinging the lead and told him if he appeared again, I would crime him, and I marked him fit for duty. Well, the next day he again appeared on the sick parade, so I crimed him and I marked him fit for duty. He was very angry. I learned shortly after he returned at once to his quarters, and within 10 minutes he had committed suicide by blowing the top of his head off with his rifle. A court of inquiry was assembled immediately, and sworn statements were taken from a number of men and officers. The man's body was placed in the remnants of a house to await burial. When a sergeant noticed that rats were eating the body, a picket was posted. That afternoon, a German shell landed directly in the house and blew it to pieces. The picket and 3 other men were mortally wounded. 3 others were severely wounded. One of the severe cases had a femoral artery cut. I applied a tourniquet and sent a runner for an ambulance. About 5 months later, I received a long form from the War Office asking me a number of absurd questions about this man. A number of men came on parade in January 1917 into the sick parade claiming to have trench feet in the hopes of getting moved out to hospital. However, my examinations revealed nothing abnormal. One fellow had bright red feet from the dye and a pair of socks sent from home. However, when the ADMS appeared or called for his foot inspection, he pressed forward complaining bitterly of pains in his feet. The ADMS believed his story until I informed him the red dye came from socks not issued by the Army. Needless to say, all sympathy vanished when the ADMS recognized him to be a malingerer. The aid post was full of rats in France, November 1915. And when things were quiet, day or night, they'd crawl out from under the duckboards and search for pieces of food. I could hear them squealing and fighting during the night. It was useless to try and kill them, because there were just too many of them. We passed a number of tanks and saw a number of tanks moving forwards. There were hundreds of dead horses lying all over the ground, and a few dead men. The tanks ran right over and crushed the horses and equipment into the mud. The crews did stop and try and pull the men to one side when they saw them. It was a terrible sight to see the dead horses being squashed out and ripped to shreds like wet paper. I was assigned to the venereal disease ward under Captain Paul, along with 3 good fellows from my unit. There were 150 VD cases in the hospital, and it was estimated there were more than 1,800 in the first contingent. You, sir, shall see me afterwards. We'll make that 1,801. March 1917, on leave to Paris. I packed and I decided to ride my horse to Amiens and the next morning catch the train to Paris. The other officers were amused at me going to Paris by myself when I could speak a little French. We visited the Louvre, Notre Dame Cathedral, Tuileries Gardens, and Washington's Monument. At the Café de la Pays, we said goodbye to Captain Harris, but Captain Harvey joined our little party. We then we paid another visit to Les Invalides, and we then visited the Eiffel Tower, Champs-Élysées, and Arc de Triomphe. At 1600 hours, we had tea in Rumpelmeyer's Tea Room on the Rue de Rivoli. It's an elegant place frequented by many of French society. It was wonderful to see so many beautiful women and their pretty dresses. At first, chlorine gas was commonly used in France, 1915. This was followed by mustard gas, which caused most of our casualties. The smell of mustard gas belied its effect. It smelled like rich candy filled with perfumed soap. Chlorine gas smelled like a mixture of pineapple and pepper. Chlorine gas led to a slow death by asphyxiation. And even the most hopeless cases sometimes took days to die. They would remain conscious until about 5 minutes before death. The effects of mustard gas did not become apparent for about 12 hours after exposure, when nausea and vomiting began. Then, it began to rot the body both inside and out. It attacked the bronchial tubes by stripping off the mucous membranes. Most cases needed to be strapped in their beds because of the pain. The skin would rise all over in mustard-colored suppurating blisters. The eyes would go blind. The victim would die, fighting for breath. Death would come after 4 or 5 weeks of torture. Once, in August 1916, a gas company arrived at our front with a considerable quantity of poison gas in tanks. Pipes were connected to these tanks and run out into no man's land. One night, orders were issued to release the gas, despite the fact the wind was blowing towards us. This nonsense resulted in about 60 of our men becoming severely gassed. I was assigned to a surgical ward for the treatment of the self-inflicted wounded in France, September 1915. I have had to remove a number of mangled fingers. This sort of thing was not for me. However, the Director of Medical Services for the entire Army ordered our hospital to be taken over by the Second Army for the treatment of these self-inflicted wounded. This worried the commanding officer, who felt that too much work was being thrust upon our FA. Captain Robertson was placed in charge, and I was to assist him. 2 days later, some self-inflicted wounded arrived, along with 2 men from divisional headquarters who would act as police to guard the patients in hospital. All of these patients were dressed in hospital blues and not allowed outside the yard. The treatment consisted simply of dressing their wounds. Some had fractures of the small bones in the hand, a few had fractures of the bones in the forearm. The inflammation was severe, and in some cases, anesthesia was administered when incisions were made to drain the infected areas. Robertson and I amputated a number of fingers and toes. One day, the commanding officer tried his hand at administering anesthetics. He made a terrible mess of it. On average, we had about 60 cases in the self-inflicted wounds hospital. Cases of attempted suicide were always transferred. A court-martial was assembled once per week, and all cases were notified to attend. A number of cases were proven to be purely accidental, and they were transferred to another hospital. Those found guilty received 2 weeks to 3 months of field punishment number 1. They lost all pay and allowances during their sentence and could not claim any disability allowances for other injuries. Most of the patients seemed like decent fellows and gave little or no trouble. However, a couple of the lads became unruly one day, and we had to tie them up to a tree in the courtyard. One charge of insubordination was laid against them, and they both received an additional 2 weeks of field punishment number 1 at the next court-martial. Every patient in the self-inflicted hospital, when found guilty, his sentence commenced from the time he entered the hospital. If he became fit for duty before his sentence had expired, he was returned under escort to his unit. If his sentence expired before his wounds had healed, he was transferred to another hospital. During my association with this hospital, we received 6 Canadians. We had a corporal from the regular unit who had shot himself in the left forearm and transferred to us. It was a severe wound, and he would have a permanent disability. He was serving a 3-month sentence. One day, he became restless and agitated, and the man next to him informed the sergeant he was afraid this man would commit suicide. Upon investigation, we discovered that he had received a letter that morning informing him that his sister had drowned when the Lusitania was torpedoed. She was on her way from Bermuda to nurse in English hospitals. We then discovered that 6 of his brothers had been killed before the end of July 1915. He and his brothers had paid their own way from Bermuda to enlist in Kitchener's army. When his last brother had been killed, he became discouraged and shot himself. He was court-martialed, found guilty, and sentenced to 3 months field punishment number 1. The commanding officer forwarded this information to the ADMS and pleaded that the man be removed from the self-inflicted wounds hospital. Orders were then received from Field Marshal Sir John French himself that this man was to be sent to number 12 CCS and be granted a full pardon. The poor chap became very emotional and cried when the orders were read to him. We received word that Lieutenant Robinson recently transferred as medical officer to the 8th Lincolnshires, had been shot in the chest on the night of September 26 and died in a few minutes. He was walking to the battalion headquarter mess across the courtyard instead of keeping to the communications trench. He was a fine, big, powerful fellow, 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. It occurred just 5 minutes before one of our FA chaps arrived at the dugout. He is buried in nearby Ridgeview Military Cemetery. I believe Lieutenant Barry of the 52nd FA has replaced him. Our Sergeant Major was placed under close arrest in France, October 1915, for a criminal offense. One afternoon, he entered the dispensary, stole a bottle of poison and a considerable quantity of opium tablets, which he then hid in a cornfield. Later that night, he was found in a very serious condition, suffering from opium poisoning. Captain Robertson immediately placed him under close arrest. The commanding officer became very excited and went off to bed expecting the Sergeant Major would be dead in the morning. Well, Lieutenant Litterdale was the orderly officer and gave him emetics to make him vomit. I used a tube to wash out his stomach. Well, the Sergeant Major recovered. A statement was taken because a court-martial was being held. A statement was taken from the accused and all of the witnesses. He asked me to be his prisoner's friend or to plead his case. However, the commanding officer said that would not be possible since I was a witness. He then asked Lieutenant Leslie to speak for him. At the trial, he was found guilty of the first offense, but not guilty of the second, attempted suicide. His sentence was promulgated the next day by Captain Robertson. Before receiving his sentence, his cap, belt, and rank were removed. He was now reduced to the ranks, that of a private, and sentenced to an additional 18 months in a military prison. He was handed over immediately to the military police. Did I tell you about Captain Nicholson? Does anyone know Captain Nicholson? Oh, you have to hear this. Early in September, Captain Nicholson, an English church clergyman, was attached to our FA. He was about 55 years of age, thin, bald, and talkative. He held a number of services on Sundays, and during the week, he would ride all over the countryside. He would get up at 0900 hours and seldom go to bed before midnight. He smoked a pipe and played a considerable amount of bridge. He was much attached to his whiskey bottle, but also enjoyed beer, wine, and champagne. He started drinking just after breakfast and would keep it up all day until a final nightcap. Everybody would get out in the morning to see the Padre mount his horse. He invariably gave the groom a severe ticking off for some slight or imagined defect in the saddle. He was also given the job of censoring letters. It worked out fine for a while, and then he would leave it till tea time for the rest of us to help him. He drank more whiskey than any 2 officers in the mess. A court-martial was held for the trial of Captain Getty in March 1917. He was accused of being drunk while on duty. He was acquitted and sent back to his regiment. Somebody had succeeded in convincing the court he was not drunk at a short time after he was arrested. However, the truth of the matter is, he was drunk as an owl at the time he was arrested. Captain Perry had been captured by the Germans in 1914. And after 10 months, in October 1915, he had been exchanged and transferred back to us. He had nothing good to say about the Germans. Before his capture, he refused to believe the stories he had heard. When captured, he was put in charge of the wounded. The prisoners were put on a train in boxcars that had been used to previously transport horses. The German officer in charge refused to allow the boxcars to be swept out. He also refused to allow the wounded to have any dressings, bandages, or splints on their wounds. A number of the men had no dressings on their wounds. During the 36-hour train trip, he refused to supply the wounded any water. At one station stop, Captain Perry approached a woman wearing a Red Cross uniform and had asked her for a pail of water. Before she handed it to him, she spit in it and called him a swine. The German officers and men spit on the wounded men who were piled into the boxcars. A number of men died on that train trip, and many were pleading for water. At station stops, local people would gather to jeer and throw insults at the prisoners. At some station stops, the people had to be restrained by the German soldiers from attacking the prisoners. The treatment of the prisoners in the German hospitals was at times terrible and cruel. It was not uncommon for the prisoners to be struck by rifle butts. The officers fared much better than the men, and the British medical officers did their best for their men. Christmas Eve, 1915. Orders were issued that there would be no fraternizing with the enemy, as there had been at the previous Christmas. Each gun fired around at 2300, and all was quiet on both sides for a number of hours. I spent Christmas Day in my soggy dugout. Someone kindly left a book, Charles O'Malley by Lever, in the dugout. This fine book helped me to take my mind off my wretched, miserable hole in the ground. January 1916. That evening, I went up to the trenches with the stretcher bearers to get the wounded. It was pure hell. German star shells were lighting up the whole field. Shells were screaming in and bursting. Pieces of timber and brick were flying in all directions. Bullets whistled like the very devil. The ambulances were only able to come as far as the gates. There were so many casualties that we had to evacuate the wounded in the daylight as well as during the night. I must say, the Hun was decent not to shell the ambulances that were in plain view. I helped the other MOs or medical officers dress the wounded at the ADS until evening. This continued on all night, all day, the next night, until at midnight I was relieved by another medical officer. The number of wounded passing through the Bedford House ADS during those 3 days averaged about 800 daily. The sentries had to be very alert because the Germans had been dressed as soldiers in British uniforms to infiltrate our lines. Proof of this occurred when the Padre was burying the dead and came across an identification disc on a soldier's neck showing he belonged to a regiment that was not stationed in our sector. The dead were then examined carefully, and more bodies were found with identification discs that showed they did not belong to regiments stationed in our sector. Some of the wounded lay on the ground in the open for 2 nights and a day before they were rescued. The Germans even began shooting at the stretcher bearers. I went out riding nearly every day in the spring of 1916. There were beautiful forests nearby with roads throughout them. There were many poppies blooming. And in some cases, they seemed to be smothering the spring crops. I went out for a brief look at the battlefield on July the 5th. It was a terrible sight. Every foot of ground has been torn up by shell fire. There were thousands of shell holes in the old German trenches. The ground was strewn with barbed wire, broken timbers, pieces of equipment. The dead were lying thick on the ground. In some places, they were lying one on top of each other. They were mostly men of the 10th West Yorkshire Regiment. When the dead were finally counted and buried, over 500 of the 10th West Yorks were found in an area only 150 yards wide by 40 yards deep. This battalion had suffered heavy losses. They had gone into action with 1,100 men strong and came out with one wounded officer and 82 men. 82 men! Most had been killed by machine gun fire from Rose Cottage. When the cottage had finally been captured, it was discovered the German machine gunner, had been chained to his gun. He had done his work well with the brutal destruction of the 10th West Yorks. He received no mercy, was killed with bombs, and buried with his gun. A large number of the British lay dead on the battlefield, but we were unable to get to them, to bury them. The battle had begun on July the 1st, and the bodies were now beginning to decompose in the heat and rain. A number of wounded died at the aid station and were piled up outside awaiting burial. A ditch, 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and 30 feet long was dug. Hooks on the ends of ropes were used to drag the decomposing bodies into the ditch. It was a horrible task. Some bodies were simply covered over in the old German trenches. Many Germans were buried in trenches, shell holes, the remnants of dugouts. Parts of human bodies were picked up here and there and buried in shell holes. In most cases, it was impossible to identify the dead. Every clergyman, regardless of faith, read the burial service over the collection of bodies. The sum was becoming a stinking, convulsing mass of filth. I had heard that during one of these attacks, 2 men had refused to go over the top. Their company commander shot them with his pistol. And of course, the rest of the company obeyed at once. The captain had only got a few feet over the top himself when he was shot in the abdomen. He was carried to the ADS by 2 stretcher bearers that had been in the trenches and had seen the captain shoot those 2 men. While I was dressing him, 2 stretcher bearers brought in one of the men he had shot. The other had since died. Since it was obvious that both were dying, I gave them something to relieve their pain and had them moved to another room out of the way, where they died side by side. These same stretcher bearers had lots of German money, which they had pilfered from the dead Germans. I warned them that they could be shot for robbing the dead, especially our own dead. Some of the men died at the aid post, but I shall never forget Private Marion in the summer of 1916. Private Marion was a runner who had been severely wounded in the right groin. When I examined his wound, I realized it was hopeless. He said he knew he was mortally wounded and asked me to look after the other poor fellows. I had him moved to one side, out of the way, and gave him some morphine to relieve his pain. He called on one of the other stretcher bearers, who was his pal, and asked him to write a letter to his widowed mother. It was a pathetic sight to see him saying goodbye to his friends and slowly passing into the great beyond. He was popular in the battalion, and only 20 years old. A number of cowards also presented themselves to the aid post. Several had self-inflicted wounds. Others pretended that they were gassed. Others said they were shell-shocked. I remember one man claiming he was shell-shocked. He came in on a stretcher. When all of the wounded were cleared away, I assembled all those who claimed they were shell-shocked. I told them that none of them were shell-shocked and they were all to return immediately to their companies. There were about 20 of them, and all but one returned to their companies. That man deserted. He was later caught near and then court-martialed and shot. My favorite major appeared at my aid post, complete with servant, claiming he was shell-shocked. I didn't know what to do with him. The MO of the West York said he was no damn use to the regiment, and that I should send him down to the hospital just to get rid of him. I replied, I knew he was a coward and that he was malingering, and I'd do anything to get rid of him. Funny thing is, this conversation took place within 4 yards of the major, who clearly heard us. So, I labeled him as shell-shocked, and by Jove, I later learned he had been returned to England as unfit for further service. He was assigned to recruiting men for the army. To top it off, he wore a gold wound stripe and was paraded as a hero. The CO and the other officers were delighted that the battalion was now rid of this fellow. In the summer of 1916, the officer who approached me pretending to be sick when I first joined up had jumped into a trench and received a bayonet wound in the leg. A sergeant later informed me that he had intentionally wounded himself. He did not come through my aid post, but insisted the stretcher bearers carry him to another aid post. But as they neared it, they came under a heavy barrage. He jumped off the stretcher and ran to another aid post. He also managed to reach England, was assigned to recruitment, and never returned to France. I attended a lecture on shell shock in January 1917. All who displayed any symptoms of the nervous sort were sent to a CCS for observation and treatment. This precaution has to be taken because thousands of troops are being sent back to various hospitals in France and even to England with shell shock. Many of these cases were simply cases of malingering to escape the terrors of the Somme. Others managed to slip back to England where, through the sympathy, influence, and plain ignorance of many medical men, were allowed to gain employment that should have gone to wounded soldiers or women. Such malingering also added greatly to the cost of the war effort in pay, allowances, and future pensions. their escape also lowered the morale of the soldiers who had stood firm and carried on. I can recall many cases of so-called shell shock. The expression became a joke amongst the better class of soldier who would belittle a man claiming he was shell shocked. It was frequently found that after a battle, a man claiming shell shock had been nowhere near an exploding shell. Some even claimed they had been knocked down by a shell explosion. I've seen them being carried from the battlefield on stretchers or being assisted by stretcher bearers. Some even pretended to be deaf or unconscious. I could spot them every time by pressing hard on the supraorbital nerve. These men were simply cowards that could not face the music. Captain Brown, a specialist in nervous and mental disorders, had worked in this branch of medicine before joining the Army. His figures indicated the chance of recovery was quite high when the treatment was carried out at a specially assigned CCS. It was also much easier to spot malingerers at the CCS. He said he'd handled over 24 cases of loss of speech, and all but one had recovered. Then, he discovered that final case was actually a very clever malingerer. He used hypnosis extensively and found it a useful way to detect malingerers. His rate of recovery was quite high. I've seen young officers who've been badly knocked about by exploding shells, even to the point of being burned by them. But these young men pleaded to remain in the battalion because they considered it a disgrace if they were sent to an FA with a shell shock label. The diagnosis of shell shock was so badly abused that an order was issued from headquarters that it could no longer be used in future on medical cards. All cases were to be marked NYD nervous or not yet diagnosed. They're separated from all FA and CCS and sent to 21 CCS. Towards the end of autumn 1916, it became so bad that many officers, NCOs, and men, when leaving the trenches, were claiming to be shell-shocked. They were charged with cowardice in the face of the enemy, and a number were found guilty, court-martialed, and shot. The offense and death penalty was generally read out on parade to every unit in the Corps. I remember several parades near Corby when the trials and death sentences were read out for 2 officers of one of the Yorkshire regiments. It has the most sobering effect on the men, and discipline improved markedly. We experienced this at close hand when one of our men was court-martialed and shot. One of these supposedly shell-shocked soldiers that I returned to his company actually turned out to be a good soldier. He rose to the rank of sergeant and even won the military medal. He later told me he had been terribly frightened, and when he saw the others pretending shell shock, he saw it as a way to escape the madness. He told me the men thought I was severe when I told them there was no such thing as shell shock. I told them I had to stop the nonsense and that shell shock could happen. MOs often diagnosed cases of shell shock just to get rid of an officer or NCO who was useless to the battalion. I had done it myself when I sent that useless major home, complete with wound stripes. Up to this time, I had only sent 4 true cases of shell shock to hospital. I remain convinced that true shell shock is rare. November 11th, 1918. We received an official wire that Germany had signed an armistice, and that hostilities would cease at 1100 hours. There was a little bit of cheering. There was a persistent rumor that we were about to be demobilized. While in Turkey on leave in April 1919, I came face to face with the Armenian genocide. That's something Turkey officially denies even to this day. Lieutenant Worsley and I dismounted to examine the basement of a large house on the outskirts of town. We saw the skeletons of hundreds of human beings. Some were of babies, children, women. Most were of men. I learned later the Turks had herded a number of people into the building, had shot them, and thrown their bodies into the basement. The Turks claimed they crawled through the basement windows and died of starvation. That did not explain the number of crushed skulls that I saw. It was July 1919. I phoned my sister Ethel at the Homestead Farm in Rosemont and told her I would be arriving home on the evening train. My mother, Dad, and Ethel, and a number of other people were on hand at the Alliston railway station to greet me. And I was driven home to the family farm in Dad's Ford touring car. After all I had been through, I was grateful to be safely home. That night, I took off my uniform and never put it on again. My career in the Army was finished, and I wondered if I would ever have to wear that uniform in the future.